I think the government's looking much more closely at, at fraud charges for leadership who are actively turning a blind eye, particularly where there are indicators that they should be paying attention to.
Before we get started with the show, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Global Training Center. As trade compliance professionals, you want to make sure that your procedures and documentation are completed as correctly as possible to avoid any delays and possible fines. We provide a range of trade compliance courses that will fit your needs. From in-person or web training to recorded on-demand courses, we can train one or even thousands on your team through your learning platform or on our portal. We can even customize a private session for your team. Go to globaltrainingcenter.com to find out more.
Hey folks, we're in for another show for the SimplyTrade podcast. Please hit the subscribe button. We appreciate you sharing it. You're listening to us. We are in for a good show, but Lalo, we have also been doing conferences and whatnot. We've got some more coming up, I guess. This is the season of conferences.
Yeah.
But you and I both had a little bit of challenges getting back on our flights.
Yeah, we just need to remind everyone, if you all see us at the conference, make sure you come up to us and talk to us. Number one, if you listen to the show, just to let us know what we're doing right or wrong, that really helps us a lot. But not only that, if you want to, be on the show just for a little quick clip or something, we're always recording at conferences. So if you see us doing that, and in the case of our next guest, Rachel, I actually ran into her at a conference. It was a very small conference. It was limited here in El Paso. And we just got to chatting and we kept on bumping into each other all day. And, eventually it occurred to me, she should be on our show. She seemed very bright and knew quite a bit about trade. And I don't know, in other words, what I'm trying to say, by holding conversations with us, I won't know who or what you are without, doing that small little chit chat. And I really got to learn, a little bit about Rachel and I thought, man, she would be a good guest for our show. So here we are. It's not just talk, we're not just saying, hey, ask me about the show and you can come on. No, that's not true. I mean, we actually do bring you on if you really want to come on and if you want to share some of your thoughts and of course if you have something to share that we like to have. And besides, even if you're not wanting to share our topic, we do also do fan shows. So if you're a fan of the show, we'd like to have you for that as well. So which we have one. We should be planning one now here in the next month or so. So she works for Nixon Peabody in DC. And so she's an attorney with that firm and obviously in the trade industry. But go ahead, Rachel. Just go ahead and let us know a little bit more about who you are and what you guys do there and all that kind of good stuff.
Yeah. So I'm a partner with Nixon Peabody. We're an AmLaw 100 law firm with offices around the country and the world. I am on our cross-border risks team. It's a really unique team that not a lot of other practices have. We fall in our government investigations and white collar section. But we are comprised of former DHS officials. So my other partners on my team are former acting ICE director, former acting general counsel, former Homeland Security Investigations special agents in charge. So we really kind of span the gamut of Homeland Security. My personal background, I was at DHS for 7 years, focusing on immigration policy, also working in headquarters on benefits, enforcement, border security, and trade issues. In private practice, I've expanded my expertise even more so in the Homeland Security space. And really, folks come to us when they need somebody to fix a problem, right? So,
that's the one thing with most attorneys is that when people are calling for an attorney, at that point there is an issue usually, and somebody's got to be the proverbial pooper scooper at the end of a parade to clean it all up, right? And that's like, there you go.
Don't get me wrong. I love all of our compliance-minded clients. I appreciate companies doing the right setup from the start. Way cheaper for them. They don't have to call me as much. But we are also, we also get brought in to do as you say, to kind of fix issues that have gone awry, help people navigate really difficult circumstances, and bring companies into compliance. Hopefully get charges dropped if necessary, and then get people back into the country because. There are a lot of these issues impact both U.S. citizens and foreign nationals. And while there are a lot of protections in place for U.S. citizens and a lot of process in place for U.S. citizens, the same can't be said for foreign nationals caught up in trade violations and other types of DHS-related criminal activity or even civil actions. And it can become really difficult to get folks back in at that point. And we help with that. So kind of across the gamut.
Well, one of the things I guess that, and this may not be where you want to go initially, but as you're talking about the immigration piece, excuse me, is the some of the things there's so many different regulations that go on. And if you're a small company, a large company, whatever, but you have non-U.S. citizens working for you, or you're even also in a vendor relationship there where non-U.S. citizens are involved, and you have, computer email logons to, computer system access and all that. Is that something that, from your perspective, just in a short, I'm thinking that is a vulnerable area that most people don't, okay, yeah, somebody will take care of that. The IT folks will take care of that. And nobody really touches on what access they should or should not have.
Multinational corporations, right, rely heavily upon employees all around the world. And sometimes they're not being thoughtful about, hey, where are we keeping the records related to all of those communications? Generally those records have to be maintained here in the U.S., even if you have foreign nationals accessing your system from abroad. So that's a regulatory requirement that, is sometimes overlooked, particularly by multinational corporations. If you're a small shop and you've got folks all over the place, it behooves you to stay on top of who's accessing your systems, what type of access they have, particularly depending upon the products that you are that are engaged in your specific trade routes. Because obviously, if you are, if you require any more substantial licensing, any type of more than standard restrictions related to your goods, then foreign nationals accessing your system sometimes need additional licenses in order to do that, or your company needs to report that information.
So the ultimate responsibility that as they're, if you've got foreign nationals in your company and things of that nature, where would DHS generally look at to say, here is where the buck stops? I mean, we can always say the CEO of the company, but I mean, in general of a big company and whatnot, where does DHS, would they, say, okay, we're holding you accountable, or you should have had some policies in that?
Yeah. I mean, look, they're going to go after the company generally, and it could impact your ability to continue sponsoring foreign nationals. It could impact your ability to participate in various trade programs or licensing programs. And it could impact and then they could ultimately, depending upon what types of issues they're looking into, they could find people in your management supply chain responsible, particularly for depending on what the issue is. They could find them responsible for fraudulent activity, for I-9 violations, for if they're here and they're not here on the right types of visas, for unlawful work authorization. If you're sharing information that you shouldn't be sharing with that foreign national, right, you're looking at potential criminal consequences, and those could apply to. Sure, it could apply to the top, but sometimes the top has a really good paper trail that, they weren't paying attention even though they were supposed to. But you have a manager who has been trained on these issues, but hasn't been carefully watching what's going on in the company. That manager could be liable for those, for those violations. Generally speaking, we see criminal, we don't see, criminal, allegations being made absent, pretty serious misconduct. So this isn't, it's very unlikely this is just a mistake, right? Mistakes are understandable, and generally you'll be subject to some type of civil violation, maybe a fine, a hand slap, maybe you have to deregister or whatever for a couple of years. Criminal violations tend to rise to a higher level and require some type of knowledge, some type of, actively, closing your eyes, right? And it's harder, right? It's harder to prove that. But in this day and age, you have whistleblowers, you have False Claims Act cases. So, False Claims Act is where, any person who knowingly submits or causes to be submitted false claims to the government is liable. Individuals can bring a False Claim Act suit on behalf of the government, and they get a cut of those proceeds. And so if you're...
All right, so help me out here before we go any further. So you're saying False Claims Act. I was going to ask you about this. So basically what I'm hearing from that is the False Claims Act is basically a intentional misdeclaration to the government. Is that...
Yep.
All right.
Intentional misdeclaration, like a dual invoicing system where you're taking a kickback and you're not telling the government. You have an employee who, is angry, who, wants to just abide by the law and finds out you're not. In addition to the various reporting channels that exist within the federal government to report that. Like CBP has an anonymous reporting channel. ICE has an anonymous reporting channel. The FBI, right? You can bring your own lawsuit against the company, and you will get a cut of whatever fines are awarded, whatever is awarded. In the recovery and the government's recovery. So, not only are you like being a good citizen and reporting a crime that you have knowledge of, you get your own lawful kickback.
There you go. Okay. So with that, let me ask this question: is that you've, in looking at some of these things, there's always the fear of, China companies have infiltrated into the U.S. economy and different things. And, before the show, you've kind of highlighted a couple of things. With DHS, I guess, going in and perusing some of the transactions going on, I think either one of two things is going on. Is that, and again, this is, I'm just average Joe here trying to look at things, and you hear different reports. Is there an effort from the Chinese companies that are either trying to circumvent certain things to get their hands on U.S. technology, and or are there efforts that Chinese companies are working on behalf of the Chinese government to do and conduct espionage type activities? So with those kinds of things, I think you had mentioned there was not a seizure, what I'm looking for, a raid of something. So was anything found? Was it like, oh no, there's, we took care of it and there was nothing there, or did they find something there?
Well, so I think you're talking about earlier this year, DHS, ICHSI raided a U.S.-based subsidiary of an auto parts manufacturer that's owned by a Chinese company. And they've been accused of trade fraud in the press. As everyone knows, The government is not necessarily the fastest of operators. These types of investigations take months and months and months, right? There hasn't been any publicly disclosed follow-up related to those allegations. Obviously, the company has very clearly stated that they have, they're guilty of no wrongdoing. I think what that raid exemplifies is a demonstrated interest and prioritization by the U.S. government focused on Chinese affiliated U.S. based companies as a response to some of the things you were talking about. There's just last week on July 25th, the House of Representatives Select Committee on the CCP introduced a bipartisan legislation called Protecting American Industry and Labor from International Trade Crimes Act. And it's focused on appropriately resourcing DOJ so it can prosecute international trade-related crimes. And it's directing DOJ to essentially establish this new structure and better resourcing attorneys within that specific portfolio within the criminal division to go after companies that they think are committing trade-related crimes and specifically targeting Chinese-affiliated companies. I think they're hooking in on the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which is focused on preventing the import of goods that have been made in the supply chain through forced labor, specifically by Uyghurs in China. And you've had other folks on your show. Shout out to Ana Hinojosa, who have talked about the impact and importance of forced labor compliance down the supply chain to avoid these types of issues. But I think what the government is seeing is, companies actively engaging in, or what they believe is happening is companies actively engaging in fraudulent activity to hide the source of their goods in the supply chain and to hide that forced labor.
Dan, I mean, that's one of the things where, what I keep coming back to on that very issue, China, of the $1 billion of goods that were seized, I think is 2 years ago in the numbers, $1 billion, only $89 million of that worth of the goods came directly out of China. It was like over 350 million was out of Vietnam and over 400 million was out of Malaysia. And so it's like the raw goods or components are moving from China to other factories around the world. And in particular, obviously Malaysia and Vietnam, but they're going to other parts of the world as well. Along with, there are reports where China is now shipping out the actual, people from, the forced labor folks, if you will, from China to other parts of the world and continuing on with it. So it's like, all right, with that, and then looking at it, I guess the thing that I want to look at, we've all talked about it. It's a big deal and all. If somebody is not properly vetting their suppliers or their supply chain, DHS is not looking kindly on that, I guess, is in looking at these kinds of things. We get to a point, it's like, what were they thinking? Is they turn a blind eye, if you would, to some of the things that are going on. There's certain red flags going on and coming up. What do you see in that, first off, what's the culpability of leadership of a company in that situation? And secondly, what's your recommendations here?
Yeah. I mean, look, I think the government's looking much more closely at fraud charges for leadership who are actively turning a blind eye, particularly where there are indicators that they should be paying attention to. I know that the government's looking at fraudulent rules of origin claims. They're looking at economic espionage, wire fraud, money laundering, some of the more traditional charges, criminal charges, for companies, for individuals who lead companies that are, actively engaged in a process by which to hide or cover up issues in their supply chain. I do think that a large majority of companies out there are attempting in good faith to comply, and it's a complex, complicated issue. It's hard and it's going to be expensive. And I think companies have finally come around to the idea that they're going to have to invest in this type of protection for their company, because the government's not ignoring these issues anymore, right? It's not going away, and it's taken a few years. But I think 2016 is when the Trade Facilitation and Enforcement Act started to go into effect. And, that's when they really started reinforcing this for goods, even goods that were needed in the U.S. economy, right? And now you have a variety of pathways where allegations regarding misconduct, regarding forced labor can be made. And, the government is collaborating together with, they're working together, which is what we want to see. And they're sharing that information. So when CBP gets a tip that someone, and maybe conducts an investigation for a WRO, right? And they decide that they have enough for a withhold release order, they're going to keep the FBI, they're going to keep HSI, they're keeping everybody in the loop. Because if they get any information that can turn that investigation not only into a finding, but if they get information that can turn that into a criminal matter, or if there are criminal components, right, related to individuals based in the U.S., they're going to take advantage of it, because that's an effective use of government resources, right? We might as well coordinate to catch all of the bad actors engaged in these behaviors. And again, I don't think everybody engaged in this is necessarily, there's lots of companies trying to do the right thing, and it can be challenging, right? But there's an equal number out there that, maybe aren't putting enough juice behind the feel-good statements they're putting out.
I love it. So in looking at that, let me ask then, from what you're dealing with, I guess, with your clients and all that, the end result, what activities do you recommend that leadership should take to prevent their companies from going awry? What should they be meeting with certain departments? Should they be asking certain questions? And if so, to who, what do you want them to do to show due diligence versus something that would earlier on could be considered negligence or gross negligence?
Absolutely. So obviously having really strict compliance programs in place, both inside the U.S. as it relates to anything being imported, and having supply chain compliance tracing mechanisms in place is going to be really critical. I think there's, obviously budget comes into play here. The size of your company comes into play here. But common sense scrutiny comes into play as well. Just because you're a small shop doesn't mean, these issues don't apply to you. If you are if a price seems too good to be true, there's probably a reason for it. And you should be looking at what the company is that you are sourcing your product from or sourcing your part from. You should be documenting what that review looks like. You should be ensuring that your entire trade team, your entire management team is trained on these issues. There's some really great trainings that CBP provides related to indicators of forced labor. There's lots of really great compliance training companies out there that offer this as a resource. And it's really not unreasonable to invest some money into ensuring that you understand this issue, to ensure that your team understands this issue, even if you end up in a difficult spot because you've made the choice to maybe buy from somebody who isn't as as careful as you are, you can at least use that information and the work you've done on your end as a buffer to, any type of investigation that could be impacting you. You can say, look, we are at least trying to do our due diligence here. Even if something fell through the cracks, you have at least proof that you're trying to do the right thing. It may not be a full, may not get you off the hook, but at least it's going to help open the door to having a meaningful conversation to the government. If it rises to the level of serious criminal activity, maybe it opens the door to a plea agreement of some kind, right?
Well, I was going to say we're going to probably need to wrap up here in a little bit, but I wanted to get this question off before we wrap up or we conclude. But it throughout our episodes on our show and even here at Global Training Center, we've seen a common theme or philosophy in that it's very obvious that trade professionals are there for compliance, and they know that that's for compliance, and we always preach almost the fact that it's very important for you to get the rest of your team involved and getting into that trade compliance mindset. In your experience and what you have seen, whenever you were at DHS or even now practicing, how often do you feel or do you think that issue was, or issues that people get into have been because of the fact that other departments, let's call it, have just neglected consulting with trade compliance, or in other words, the trade compliance person finds out when it's too late. You know what I mean? Like, does that happen often, or is it just, I don't know. I'm just kind of curious. I guess just trying to put that point across as that everybody in your company should have some visibility to what's going on trade-wise.
Yeah, I think I couldn't agree with you more. Everybody in the company should have a minimal understanding of compliance issues. Requiring them to take an hour training is a really low threshold to at least flagging the types of issues that should be red flags for them. I think in the civil violation context, it's a huge issue, right? This is a huge issue. Somebody putting the wrong category, somebody putting the wrong amount, somebody, abusing maybe the de minimis loophole. Those are things that could easily lead, or a series of those activities could, easily trigger serious civil violations or serious impacts to the company. I think that it is going to be less likely that these things happen accidentally for the level that it would need to turn into a civil or a criminal issue. But it's not necessarily impossible, right? Particularly if you aren't paying attention from a whole of company approach regarding what's going on. And if you aren't paying attention, if you don't have that compliance mindset as a whole of company approach, it is much more likely you're going to be the target of individuals who are seeking to take advantage of the work you're doing, right? And that's where trade secret issues come in. That's where economic espionage issues come in. That's where money laundering, wire fraud issues come in, right? And so I do think it all plays together.
Well, I will say that as we keep on going with this, is that the ultimate would be use common sense, I guess, in your vetting process. You're going to
get rid of my job, Andy, by telling people that.
No, listen, there's still a lot of folks that are out there thinking that they're smarter than the government. They can get away with things, and it's still going to catch up with them. I mean, as you just said, you got the good compliant folks, and then you got those that, with all due respect, you're just plain stupid to try. It's not dumb. You're stupid. It's like you're doing something that you shouldn't be doing. So, as my grandmother would say, you ought not to do it. But with that, I guess it's, as you're going through and looking at it, There's legislation way back. It's old stuff. The Sarbanes and Oxley legislation comes to mind. That legislation says that any and all transactions that you're involved in, you should make sure, no matter what it is, it could be financial, it could be customer service, it could be emails, it could be, whatever it is, you should cross the T's and dot the I's and make sure that the information you're putting forward is accurate. And that's where that lends itself, in my opinion, to phenomenal. If you adhere to Sarbanes and Oxley, there are safety nets in there that your bureaucracy of your company should be catching something. And the big thing is that if there's a red flag, I always tell when I was with my staff, I said, if in doubt, check it out. It's like if something's coming up, don't just let it sit there and assume it's something's gone awry. But that's where further down the road it goes, and people continue to let something happen. It takes that much more to get back on track. So,
absolutely. One of my bosses told me early in my career, you got to go slow to go fast, right? And I think that applies to companies too. Like, you need to make sure that you have these compliance processes in place. You have to make sure you're doing things the right way so that you can then, continue to be successful, and you can be successful in the right way.
Is there anything on the DHS agenda right now that people should be looking at? Is like, for example, new regulations that are being considered, whatever, under different agencies that companies should be looking at getting involved to provide input from your perspective? And I would assume to do input through a trade association of some kind rather than directly.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think you're going to see increased WROs. You're going to see increased findings. I mean, CBP is interested in and asking for more funds to staff up the folks doing that work. And I think those investigations are very involved and lengthy, but they need more people to do them. And I don't think they're lacking in terms of allegations being submitted, right? It's just a matter of resources and prioritizing which ones are the worst to go after. But I think that's an easy bipartisan issue to get funding for. And so I wouldn't be surprised to see more. I don't know that we'll see more, regulatory action in that space. I think industry would want to fight for that in that regard, kind of opposite to what industry normally fights for. But right now, those investigations are pretty open-ended and kind of a black hole and hard to fight. And with, maybe with some more regulatory detail regarding what is considered and how those evaluations are made, industry would be in a better place to respond. But that's kind of opposite what our usual take is.
Just as you mentioned WRO, for our listeners, there's a lot of them not in the you're talking to withhold for release orders. Yeah, that means that basically your goods are coming in, and if they're opening up an investigation, let's say for forced labor against it, you're not going to get your goods. They're holding the release and go through the investigation on that before it will be released, right?
Right. And those investigations can take years.
So, folks, that's the thing, is that if you're not vetting your suppliers appropriately, the products appropriately, and all that, stop and think. Rachel just mentioned this as far as some of these actions that are going underway, and you need to be aware of that. But that little item right there is, here you've got 10,000, 100,000, maybe $1 million or more tied up in a shipment of goods coming in. It gets stopped at the port of clearance, and a WRO is listed or issued. That means the goods, you can't touch them, you can't do anything with them, and yet your money's tied up and the investigation's going on, and you're supposed to supply information. You're stuck in a quandary if you've not done a good job, right? Ahead of time.
Absolutely.
So, well, we're going to have to wrap this up. For any last comments, Rachel, from your perspective on things?
look, I think that compliance and investment in compliance is the smartest thing any company can do on the front end. You minimize the amount of time and resources you're going to ever have to dedicate to fixing your problem on the back end. Problems are going to come up no matter what, even with the best compliance practice. But you're only doing yourself a favor by doing the work on the front end.
And with that, I would say a strong collaboration. You mentioned this way early in our conversation, a collaboration of your compliance and let's say your purchasing groups and your legal groups and your IT groups and all the different things we talked about. I mean, we even touched on the immigration scenario there and foreign nationals and all that. Folks, it's like having a collaborative effort on that is what's going to keep you out of trouble. So, Rachel, man, I tell you what, it's like I'm glad Lalo ran into you. Obviously, you were also very highly recommended by one of our friends, Larry Hansen. So that's a good thing, and really like Larry. So he's a good guy. So that's another one that comes into play. So you're high in our books. Thank you so much.
Thank you guys for having me. This was so much fun.
Folks, with that, we're going to turn this back over to you. We will have Rachel Winkler's contact information in our show notes if you're interested in reaching out and talking with her even more. So with that, have a great day.
Thank you very much for joining us. SimplyTrade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the show or would like to sponsor SimplyTrade or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com or you can DM us on Twitter at SimplyTradePod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. SimplyTrade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by SimplyTrade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.